So here we are, Renee, and I believe you're on the road today. Is that true?
I am on the road today. I'm in the great state of Georgia, in the city of Atlanta, where they say you come on vacation and leave on probation.
Oh, do they say
Yeah, I
that?
know.
You have a little
The
southern
paroling
drawl. You've
authorities.
got a southern drawl. You're starting to
I've been hanging
bring
out
out.
here too long, y'all. Yeah, it's
Wow.
been funny. So I know in the great state of Georgia. So I'm here for the Association of Parole Authorities International at a conference with my whole team. My whole team is here of the Board of Parole, and we are learning a ton. I've been here now for a few days, and so happy to be here. So today we're going to talk about some of the things we've learned and what in the world does parole and mental health have to do with each other. And I'm going to tell you it has everything to do with everything, which is why I'm here and why I'm excited about this conversation. So, but before we kick all that off, Jason, what's going on the farm this time of year?
Well, usually we're getting the grain dryer ready for fall, but right now we're having issues at home with the clothes dryer. So if I want to do laundry, I have to take my farm clothes to the farm and do laundry there until the new dryer gets
Uh,
delivered here at the house. So yeah, it's kind of rough. Sometimes stuff just breaks and you've got to get new stuff and it's painful. So that's my whitey
yeah,
farmer of the week right there.
but it's always costing money. That's the farmer,
Oh,
the trend that always is, right? So if it's not costing you
right.
money on the farm, it's costing you money at home, right? Something's
Everything.
broke. What a
Something's
pain.
always broken. I'm
What a
always
mess.
fixing something. So that's where we're at.
That's where you're at. So I got the opportunity to be on a panel that was called Sharing Considerations Across the Globe. And I'm still kind of surprised as to how I got on this panel in the first place, because I was really sitting on a panel with a Supreme Court justice from Wales area of Australia and a prosecutor from the United Kingdom and a female prosecutor from Georgia and me, and I'm none of those things. And so the setup was pretty entertaining in my head all by itself, because we were reading these CVs and bios about all of these accomplishments, and then there's me. And so I was like, okay, this is pretty fun. So I got to do that, and that's what sort of this conversation is going to be about today, because we know by having conferences that things are similar nationwide, but we don't always think about like what are those challenges globally. And what's really interesting, there's a lot of themes that are kind of in common across the globe.
Why don't you tell us about some of those themes? I know I was just rereading the general session description, Renee, and it's pretty impressive, this panel that you were part of. I am wondering though, as we think about the overlap between mental health and corrections, right? What were some of the conversations that you all had there as you were looking at what the shared issues are around the globe?
Yeah, there's some real big themes. Housing is a theme across all jurisdictions, especially for folks with more difficult crimes. So if they've got sexual offenses, those are very hard to house moving forward. Arson, very hard to house moving forward. Some of the capital punishments, in some countries they call them capital punishments. We call them that. I guess they could technically be that, but the more severe crimes. So housing is a big one. Also, the conversation around substance use and mental health, which that varies by jurisdiction as far as what things they're involved in, but those common illnesses in the mental health space are common across all countries. And so you and I know, because we do mental health, like
Mhm.
schizophrenia rates are the same across the globe
Right.
per population. It's a genetic situation. And so those real severe illnesses are similar. Now, there are some differentials in like how often the United States will diagnose things versus maybe the UK or versus Australia on some other things like anxiety, depression, ADHD, some of those other common diagnoses. But some of the severe mental illness, the data shows it's consistent across all global groups, which is how you know it's a genetic component. It's not just overprescribed or things that you might hear in our vernacular in the United States, but it's the same. So we were talking about some of those issues. Other things that are similar, we can dive into these, but like data or lack thereof,
Hmm.
assessments or lack thereof. So it was just really fascinating conversation because we're all struggling in the same areas, and just the job itself is very similar. The person on the parole board's job is to decide when it's safe to release somebody considering public safety. But the how you do that is very widely different depending upon the jurisdiction. And it's very interesting.
Well, let's talk risk assessments because I think across the board, that's something that people are very interested in is finding a way to evaluate these things that takes it away from kind of that human emotion perspective and just
Yeah.
lets us know, is this person going to be at risk? How likely are they to reoffend? How are those risk assessments going? Like, there's a lot of them, aren't there, Renee? Tell me about
Yeah, there
kind
really
of
are.
what
Yeah,
the
there are.
discussion was at this
So
conference.
there's two types of risk assessments. You have a static assessment that they do the first time somebody comes into prison, and there's multiples of those. We'll get like an IQ as an example, or you'll get their general risk assessment. And what they do for those, typically that static assessment is to try to determine from the corrections point of view what level of supervision they need, what type of programming they need while they're incarcerated. And those are the two general drivers of that static type assessment. And those also are different than for folks that have sexual crimes because it's not the same type of behavior that you're actually looking for. And the risk for people incarcerated with sexual crimes is different and higher because you could put them in with others and get more challenges
Hmm.
from that. So you've got two different types of assessments there to begin with. The one that the board needs to be more of a dynamic assessment tool where you're looking at they came in at these higher scores, but as they're going through rehabilitation, treatment, training, programming, that their risk scores lower so that you have a prediction of how they would do on the outside. That's the general goal. And that seems to be lacking across all jurisdictions. It is fascinating. And so the panel, for those that will listen to this podcast ever, will understand that I am pretty now boring when I speak and not by the book on a few things. And so when we got to the part talking about risk assessments, everybody was dead silent on the panel. Nobody wanted to ask. And I kind of made a joke. I'm like, well, do I have to answer? And the crowd laughed. And I said, no, they don't work at all. And the whole room just erupted because we've been told that we've got these assessments and then and we're supposed to be data informed and all of these things, but if your data, some of the assessments are built on, like one of the more popular ones was built out of Canada, maybe back in maybe the 80s or
Hmm.
90s, and they're still using the assessment today. It just doesn't translate. Victims aren't even a part of the system post
Hmm.
sentencing in Canada at all. And so they tried to just add this victim component to it to make it Americanized. And I'm just here to tell you it doesn't work. And so we're really lacking in this space. And so one of the awesome partners that is brought on with this conference and that works with this authority is called Arnold Ventures. They're a foundation. The Arnold family is looking into doing hard things and making system changes. And so things that can be research based that could like be used nationwide and globally. And so they are actually really diving in on this risk assessment idea because you really need your own data of your own people to determine what works in your jurisdiction because the laws are so widely different state to state and even more so
Hmm.
country to country. And so that's what I learned is that there's not really as good of data as people would like to think there is.
Well, and I think that's important to recognize when we don't have the data we should have, because there's this idea out there that we should just have data on everything and everything should be evidence based. And we see that in rules and legislation all the time that we have to adopt something evidence based. Well, maybe the evidence-based thing doesn't exist. And so we do have to, it takes
No.
time to develop these things and then to validate them. And then sometimes
Right.
they don't measure what we think they're measuring. And we know we talked about that. We talk about that all the time on this
Right.
podcast, that's one of the concerns. And so it's refreshing to be open and honest about the subject that it's not there yet. We don't
Yeah.
have what it takes.
Well, it was interesting to me. The lady from Britain, she was saying that it's much more helpful for her to get a psychological evaluation than to look at a risk assessment.
Yeah.
100% agree
Yeah.
because you actually get real time information and like know today if they're stable, where they are, if they're medicated or not medicated, or if medications helps or don't or whatever. But it's much more timely. And so it isn't so much that the risk assessment isn't a good tool, but it's not timely. It's not today. And then the other thing that many people, a lot of these tools are relied upon that the frontline worker is the person doing the assessment and just the education level or the professionalism of that group of people varies widely.
Yep.
So you can get really great assessments and really poor assessments because of how it's administered. And so it's not even like a standardized way of administering. It's not like, if you remember back in the day when you had to take your tests to get into grad school, where you had to be in the room at a certain time with a certain number of pencils for this many hours, and everybody had the test was exactly the same for everyone. Gosh, no, this is like whoever is the frontline worker does, the assessment however they choose to do it. And so when I told them, which I've talked about this on the podcast before, but our dynamic risk assessment, I don't know that I know what it's supposed to look like, nor do I care. They tell me it's evidence-based. They tell me it's valid. Okay. I can tell them it's not because I can read 50 of them and no two look alike. So without even having to know what the original is supposed to be, I can tell you it's not just because no two look the same, right? So you can tell very quickly without having to be a super scholar on evidence-based practices whether or not the tool you're using is good or bad, simply because if you set 10 of them side by side by 10 different counselors, are they even close to the same thing? And the answer is no. And so it was refreshing to know that that's not just us. And it is that dynamic tool that is missing, and that there's a real opportunity there for people to figure that out and to make some big changes, and that people are excited about and thinking of AI. Could AI help
Right.
in that process? How could we get like better tools? And so I think it's coming, and I think it's necessary that it's coming. But right now, it was, I guess, refreshing and kind of assuring that I'm not the only one that doesn't have the best options. Because sometimes you're told you have to have that, but then you don't. And so then, like, what do you do then?
Yeah, and I think it's exciting what's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years with AI, and the ability to use data differently. And as we think about data, as we kind of move into the next segment, we are going to put in the show notes a really great place to go where you can find data all across the United States specific to your state. And I don't know if you've never been to prisonpolicy.org before. It's something that we use a lot when we go into other states. If we would kind of want to look at who's in jails and prisons in that state, or kind of what are some of the issues they struggle with, because we see a lot of times folks with mental health conditions and substance use disorders, where do they start out? Usually in the local jail. Oftentimes, unfortunately, before their first treatment episode, there's that engagement with the criminal justice system that starts everything out. And so we kind of did a quick look at our home state in some of the data. And Renee, you actually validated, said, hey, those numbers look about right, which is we would hope that they do, right? And so, we
Yeah.
know from the backside and the front side that this is pretty solid data. They're constantly uploading data they get from all over the country. What are some of the highlights? What jumped out at you as we kind of scrolled through the data when we clicked on our home state of Iowa?
Yeah.
What did you see when you
Well,
first?
the prison population was dead on. It's about 8,600 people,
Mhm.
which I don't know if that's a lot or not a lot, but there's only really 3 million people in our state. So 8,600 sounds kind of high. It's pretty small population compared to a lot of other states. Like, met Pennsylvania this week, and I think they said they're in the process of closing. They have closed 3 prisons already, and they're going to close down 2 more, but they were at maybe 30 prisons to start. So, it's just a different scale when you're talking to other states. So 8,600 for 3 million people could be good, could be bad. What I didn't know is that we have 3,600 people in federal custody. I do see those, but we don't really track numbers in our state. So what we see is our guys, they would like to be off parole in our state so they can step to lower levels at the federal level. Apparently, they get left at medium custody or higher at the federal level if they're on parole in a state. So they would like to be able to get off that in your state, of whatever state you're in, so that they can step down to lower level of custody. And in some cases, lower level custody can equal additional treatment in the federal level. So when you're looking at when we look at those kind of cases, sometimes if that person needs that longer term substance use treatment, it makes more sense for us to let them off parole so they can get into those in the federal level. So you have to, there are people whose sole job it is to do these compacts, detainers, interstate compacts, and deal with the federal government that bring those to us. So it was good to see that number. The other one I think was surprising to me, and you worked on this in Nebraska, was the number of involuntary people committed
Yeah.
You were looking at it from pre-sentence space
Right.
of, competency to stand trial, but we have 140 of those that are involuntary committed. Now, I know that that numbers pulled out here, but what I know is that those are in the big prison population number, because
Mhm.
those the guys that are involuntarily committed come up for review, but they still live in the same prison with other people.
Mhm.
They're just committed. So it's not like a different spot or place. And so I think these numbers could be misleading to some, thinking those people are locked up in a special involuntary place. That's not a thing. They're in the regular custody setting, just can't leave until
Oh.
they've cleared their involuntary commitment.
Yeah, one thing that also pops out to me as we look at this, we often pull a slide and put in our slide decks when we do speaking across the country, is how much higher our incarceration rates are compared to the rest of the world. You were talking
Yes.
about state to state, we look good, but we're still 6 times
Yes.
higher than
Yes.
United Kingdom, Portugal, Canada, France, Belgium, Italy, Denmark, Netherlands, Norway, Iceland, right? Their incarceration
Yes.
rates are significantly lower than the United
Yes.
States across the board. I mean, when you compare nationally, when you compare to every state, it's it's jarring to actually look at this
Yes.
on a graph. What do you think about that,
Yes.
Renee, when you see that?
Yeah, a couple of different things. So I'm wondering if, our system, isn't providing those basic things necessary to keep people from making these horrible choices to be incarcerated. One of the panels I got to listen to yesterday had folks who were committed as youth. They call them youthful offenders. We call them juvenile lifers, where they were given a life
Mhm.
sentence as a juvenile. And in either case, they murdered somebody typically before the age of 18. And so laws have changed where they now have in all states in our country have the ability for parole potentially. But one of the gentlemen speaking said, he believes in second chances. He goes, but in my case, it's a first chance. Because if
Yeah.
you listen to his story about how he was raised, he never had a shot to even
Mhm.
make it successfully from the way his childhood went down. And so he said, I didn't know anything differently. So I didn't even know there was a different type of life. And so when you start thinking about it from that perspective, sometimes we get frustrated with these young people who have, made these horrible choices. But if they don't know differently, then they haven't been set up to succeed. And so what I'm wondering about from a big picture, since that's you and I do, I'm wondering if we're just not setting up those basics. And we'll talk about this more in the next segment about what could we do to move upstream. But if you don't have housing and you don't have food and you don't have family who can care for you because they're working 24/7 and you're just on your own as a little kid or whatever,
Mhm.
you start making illegal in bunny quotes, decisions to get fed, to provide for your family, to take the things you need to live. And then you're in the system very quickly for a theft or whatever, and it snowballs very quickly. And then if you're then released at some point on those smaller crimes and you don't have, say, a vehicle or transportation to get to your follow-up appointments, or you don't have, the money you need to make rent or whatever the next pieces are, you easily can then revoke back because you can't stay where you said you were going to stay. You can't go to the treatment you said you were going to do. And so we set up the system for people to fail in sometimes. So part of this week is really ingrained upon me to be thoughtful about, the conditions I set for somebody for release. Do I think they are fair that they could actually meet them, or are they overly burdensome when they'll never get there?
Well, to build
That's a
upon
big
that,
piece of this.
it's the same issue on the front end. Our local jails, 74% of people in our local jails, when we read the data on here, they're not convicted of a crime. They're still presumed innocent.
I
And
don't
so
understand that.
if we
I
look at
don't get that
it's
data.
it has a lot to do with pretrial policies
Yeah.
changing in our state in the late
Yeah.
90s. And in 2000, we saw the rates just explode across our state of the number of individuals, unconvicted folks who are housed in our local jails, which means people can't go to work, they can't pay their rent, they don't have the support of the local community. And so, kind of to your point of both on the front end and on the back end, we set people up for failure in our system. And it's really unfortunate because then that just creates an even larger issue.
We had talked about this when it was talking about when we went through COVID and the shutdown.
Yeah.
But for many, many months, courts were shut down.
Yep.
And so people were still getting picked up and just sat somewhere. And the post COVID, a year or two post all of that, we were still letting people out that basically they were on medication, couldn't get their medication. So they made a bad choice, got arrested, and then they didn't even get to court for months
Yeah.
and months. And we've heard that not just our state, that was multiple states,
Yep.
I've worked in where that happened. And so, those things are still happening today. So that number, that was probably the most surprising on that data. I did not have any idea there were that many people kind of pre-sentencing stuck in jail. And if you're just stuck there because you can't make bond, or you're stuck there because, maybe in some cases, how high your sentence is. But on the other hand, some people get pretrial release and are out and about. And so it's because they had quote a good lawyer,
Mhm.
right? So it's like is that a fair system? Is that
Yeah.
equitable? I'm not going to
No.
judge, but I don't know that I think so.
Well, once again, go and look at your own state and see what you find. I could click around and look at states all day long, and just pick out these
Yeah.
things. But I think that's the power of using data, right? Is if you have access to this type of data, is it being used to advocate and change policy, or is it just data that sits on a shelf, right? Like we should be using
Mm,
this data and we should be using it and bringing it in front of folks who can make changes. And when we think about changes, Renee, what could we do differently, right? Kind of moving us further, what are the options that we have? What are changes local communities, even counties, regions, what could they do and implement at a local level that we could start changing the number of folks who are in our jails or the number of
yeah.
folks that we support who are coming out on probation? What are some of those things that we know work that are really tough to get implemented?
Oh, well, and this is how this ties right into mental health, behavioral health, is really getting people the help they need on the front end for both
Hmm.
of those types of issues. All of the issues that are in behavioral health. And the more we can treat people and get them the help that they need and on the right path, whether it's for sobriety or whether it's for just stability in their disease, we're going to be ahead in this game because we've heard story after story from state after state about people going to be incarcerated so that they can get their medication or getting, while they're incarcerated, they can be forced to take their medications
Hmm.
to a degree. Don't think that they just get it shoved down them. They don't. And they can be in trouble, but they get in trouble then for non-compliance of their medical
Hmm.
regime if they choose not to take it. So there are consequences for not taking your medication while incarcerated. So there are opportunities for stability. The other big opportunity for sobriety is they're sober. And I'm not going to say none of our institutions have issues with drugs. We do. But generally speaking, you can be sober easier inside because you're not around the same people. You're not around the same the friends that got you in trouble. You don't have as easy of access. You may still have access, but not as easy of access of your drug of choice. And so sobriety can come while you're incarcerated. So then it becomes, well, this is the place to stick everybody so that they sober up and they get stable on their meds. And that's backwards. If we were doing that in the community, then they wouldn't have to be incarcerated in the first place.
Yeah, and what one of the things is we're struggling with here is, I think about like specialty courts. How can we divert people or diversion programs,
Right.
right? There's
Yep.
lots of different ways we can look at this. But how do we know if they're effective, right? I don't know if I didn't even talk to you about this, but I got a call from a reporter in our neighboring state, and he sent me some data because he's worried about the number of commitments is decreasing in that state, even though the number of petitions is going up. Well, there's
Mm,
a lot of information we don't know. Is that a problem? We don't know on the mirror side of that. Are more people going to jail instead of a mental health commitment and seeking treatment? Are people being diverted and getting the treatment they need before they need to be
mm,
involuntarily committed? Right? All of those systems tie together, but we don't have a good way of understanding and looking at the numbers together so we know what's actually making an impact. Is it because of a specialty court? Is it because more people went to jail? Is it because the system's just functioning more efficiently? Or is it
right.
because the system's broken? We don't have any of
Mm.
those answers when we just look at a couple data points. And so we really have to get better at understanding this population and supporting this population.
Yeah, and even the petitions, right? In our state, it's just two adults can file a petition for
Right,
somebody to be held for 72 hours for a
right,
review or an assessment. And so any two people, so it could be, the ex-girlfriend and her
right.
mom who are really pissed off at the boyfriend, and they can file a petition.
It,
So do they just have a bunch of,
Right. Maybe people
interesting
just are more
scenarios?
knowledgeable. Maybe people are more knowledgeable about the
Yeah,
system and
could be.
that being a tool. And so that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, petitions
No.
have gone up exponentially in the last 10 years. Well, that may not be a problem. People are more aware. People are more tuned into mental health. Maybe that's a positive thing. It's
Eh,
just really hard to answer those questions, right? Because we know
Right.
specialty courts work. We know specialty courts help keep people out of jails and prisons. helps connect people to treatment. We've also seen some really good things out of some diversion programs, right? That take low-level offenders,
Mhm.
keep them out of the local jail, keep them at work. And so we see a lot of county attorneys' offices really working on these initiatives, but it's county by county. And I'm a systems guy. I really prefer to see things happen more globally than this kind of you know, random, I'm going to do it here and then we're going to try it here. And if it doesn't work, we walk away from it. How do we get everyone on the same page moving forward, Renee?
That's the $1 million question. So, one of the things that was brought to light this conference, and it is every time I attend something like this, is that our policies and procedures, if we're not careful, can actually increase
Mm-hmm.
rates of people
Yep.
coming back to prison, revoking back to prison,
Mm-hmm.
or getting out of or being incarcerated in the first place. So, let me give you an example. So, when I release somebody on parole, I can set extra, like they're considered extra conditions, special
Mm-hmm.
conditions. There's already this long list of rules and regulations and conditions that are required from somebody, just the general person leaving a building. And those are a lot of different things. And so, they're going to have to work and they're going to have to stay at the location they said they are. They're going to have to check in with their parole officers so often. It goes on and on and on. Well, then the board can add additional codes and additional things. And most of ours are treatment related in many cases where we say, hey, we want them to continue mental health treatment. We want them to get them continue their substance abuse treatment. Those aren't bad. But when you start thinking about how sheer number of things they're told to do, we have to think about, is that helpful or not helpful? And so sometimes the policies that you make are not really setting us up for success. We're having policies. So here's an example I learned just for the first time this week. There is a group called the Incarcerated Children Advocacy Network. This group is of folks that are called either youthful offenders in some places, or in our state, they're called juvenile lifers, where they committed life crimes prior to 18. And the Supreme Court has said that we need to give them consideration for parole because their brains were not fully formed before the age of 18 when they made this decision. And so, because they were childish in their thinking, we need to give them the opportunity for parole. That does not mean they have to come out very quickly. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it gives you a lot of latitude on whatever. But there's this network of people that started from a guy who was incarcerated and others that were youthful offenders who started this network, and it's nationwide. And it's called the Increased Children Advocacy Network. Now, one of the parole conditions typically is you cannot hang out with felons. That means that this organization, who's specifically designed to help people stay out that were youthful offenders because they understand, have lived it, have overcome, are involved in their community, and many, many times because they get a second shot of life, they have a purpose, they're out doing great things. We say they can't be with felons, and as a big general rule, and then would exclude this amazing group of people who are on the other side and making a
Mm-hmm.
massive difference in this community. And so what they're saying is several states now have relooked at that particular condition to rethink that. And so not all felons are bad felons. So
Mm-hmm.
people that were a felon and have this label, just like we think of
Mm-hmm.
labels in mental health, being stigmatized.
Mm-hmm.
The word felon and the word juvenile can be stigmatized. You think of juvenile, you don't normally think of that word in any other sentence except detention or crime or whatever. So it's not like necessarily, it's just a word, but we've made it sound like something else. So that particular condition of not being able to associate with felons sounds promising to many, but it excludes some of the best peers that could help somebody through their
which
reentry.
which I think that's the issue you bring up is what we know works is support, and whether it's on the very front end to
Yes.
divert or on the back end to keep people from recidivating, both of those things we know what works is additional support. And so it means peer support, it means social workers, it means anyone who can help navigate you through the system and support you so you don't reoffend. And so we know on the back end it's very effective in groups like that keep people from reoffending. We also know from some of these diversion programs that there's one local program that served 800 people and they were able to show that recidivism was only 12%. It's generally 60% for everyone else who goes through that court system. And this is just simple misdemeanors that they kept 800 people from having to go through the system. And so I'm just wondering we see the data and we also see the cost savings. In this instance, it costs $2,000 to bring someone to trial. It costs $200 to have a social worker work with someone and divert them and follow up and make sure they went to their substance abuse evaluation and then had
Right.
ongoing treatment. So it saved our county $1 million just to divert 800 people from the courts. And so I'm just wondering, there's a cost value. There's also a human factor that,
Hmm.
and it demonstrates it decreases recidivism in a huge way. And so when we think about on the front end or the back end, a group who wants to come in and support people who have made really poor decisions in their childhood and now have grown beyond that point and are ready for that first chance, not even a second chance. Why aren't we putting more dollars to these things? Because we're going to see cost savings exponentially over the
Right.
next decade if we did.
Well, this reminded me of a thing that I wanted to tell you. It'll blow your mind on the data. So
Uh-huh.
recidivism is not measured the same way depending
Oh,
upon who you
right.
ask. There's
Sure.
three versions: rearrest, reconvicted, or reincarcerated. Very, very different things
Yep.
because you could be rearrested and not convicted or incarcerated.
Right.
You could be reconvicted and still stay out. You could be
Mhm.
reincarcerated and that maybe never even convicted of a new crime, but
Right.
you're reincarcerated because you're revoked. And so, yeah, that just blew my mind this week, reminded me that, you kind of have to dig into what are we actually measuring.
Yep.
And in our state, they look at just incarcerated. So basically, if
Yep.
you've gotten arrested and have a misdemeanor and didn't make it back to prison, I don't think it counts in the numbers that we count in Iowa. And I don't know if that's right, wrong, or indifferent. I just know that it doesn't mean the same thing. So when we're talking about like recidivism, you kind of have to dig in and go, well, what did that actually mean? Did they actually, because it's a big, big deal, right? If nobody's rearrested
Hmm.
and not reconvicted at that early. I mean, if they're really not rearrested, that's big, big change. And that particular group, that ICAN group that I noted that'll be in the show notes, they actually their rates are very, very low because people get into that program and then they're making such a difference in the community and out speaking and educating on these changes for policy and all of this that they don't really even in that network don't
Hmm.
even know people that have gone back to prison. And so their philosophy is if you're a young person and given a second chance of life, why in the world would you squander it? And that's a really great place to be
Yeah.
for them. Unfortunately, that's not everybody. We have some that have come back. So I know it's not everybody, but it's a pretty cool opportunity. So we don't want to be the people, quote, in power that are preventing that support. It doesn't make any
Hmm.
sense. So before we go today, I just want to talk about the recovering politician self-care policy of the week. I'm going to remind all of you, remind myself that when you're on vacation, you still should keep your routines to the best of your ability. So there's a gym here in the hotel. I've been there every morning. That's where I meet some great people that I end up, kind of befriending because you see each other in the gym in the
Hmm.
morning. So you're all the early birds. And so you chat, oh, hey, I saw you in the gym and whatever. And just whatever it is you normally do to take care of yourself. So getting out and take a walk, getting out into the sunshine, grabbing that cup of coffee, whatever it is that's part of that routine. It's easier to travel if you just keep on a routine, and it's easier to adjust back home when you keep that routine. And so for me, it was just a top of mind reminder that I need to stay healthy and make sure that I pack accordingly for those things so that I feel good when I can be here doing all the work that I need to do and then roll right back into a full schedule when I get home. And so to do that, just have to stay on that routine. So Jason, I know you have the entire month of June. You are traveling in all over the place, 3, 4 different cities. So what is your plan on that routine moving forward for you?
It's really scheduling out and making sure my sleep pattern stays the same. I
Yeah.
mean, sometimes, it just happens. You do a late flight or something. But, for the most part, if I know I'm going to be gone every week, and traveling a lot every
Hmm.
week, and some of it's a lot of driving because, it's rural, Renee. So
It's
we
rural.
we
It's
go to
rural.
the rural most
You go.
areas. It's sometimes take an extra hotel night. Sometimes it's extra night just to keep on that sleep cycle, of getting to bed by, 10 o'clock at night.
Hmm.
Just keeping that routine is really a big deal for me. So it's really, eating on time and sleeping on time. Of course, shoving in exercise when I can and things like that are, of course, important. But really, it's
Yeah.
about keeping that sleep because, last thing I need to be doing is, driving until 1 a.m. to get home, and then you're just thrown off. And then two
Yeah.
days later, if I have to leave for somewhere else, then I'm still dragging. And, that makes it less fun. I do this for fun. Yeah. And so it's like if we're going to do it for fun, then it means if I need to take an extra night somewhere, even if it seems kind of ridiculous just to stay on track, then that's going to be the way it goes
That's
because it
right.
just makes the experience so much better. And I
It
get
sure
more out of
does.
it. I'm more myself when I'm meeting
Mm,
people and talking and doing all the things that we do. So,
yeah. You just mentioned fun, and I'm here at a conference where people are talking and they're not having any fun while doing it. And I
mm,
don't get that.
yeah,
Like, why are you speaking
no,
if you're not having fun doing it? Because that means nobody in the audience is having fun
right,
either. No
right.
good. Well, today, everybody, we were live from Atlanta talking about the Association of Parole Authorities International and like how does parole and mental health and what do they have in common? And I'm telling you everything, everything, everything. There's very, very rarely that you find somebody that doesn't have either a substance use issue or mental health or both, in addition to sometimes some intellectual disabilities, some other types of challenges. And so, how do we care for them? It really is talking about looking upstream, thinking about those preventative things that we can do to divert from the system to get them the help and treatment they need so that prison and jail is not the best treatment they've ever received. Those statements are terrible. We need to be doing a much better job on the outside, looking at communities and how we can build those things into the community. Well, thanks everybody for listening. Before you go, please follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook. If you follow us, you'll get a prize. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.